Welcome to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com. So I'm doing something a little bit different for the next couple of episodes. What I'm going to do is replay some of the most popular episodes over the last year in the lead up to episode 500. Now, I've done this a couple times before. Still the same great content, just a couple replays. Episode 500 will be amazing.
I am your host, Darryl W. Perry, the Liberty Penguin, the Wombat, the uncut cocaine of libertarianism. And you know what day it is. That's right, it's a Friday, and you know what that means. Yep, that's right. It's the day that I answer your questions. I've got a lot of them, and I'm glad I do. Because I love having a number of questions to go through, and then it gives me the opportunity to where if I don't wind up getting through everything, I've got some leftovers that I can get to next week. So, as always, send questions to ama@fppradio.com. That's AMA as in Ask Me Anything at fppradio.com. First question. When is an animal owner liable for medical expenses related from that animal? And I think I've mentioned this previously on this show. I know I've mentioned it on Free Talk Live and other outlets. I don't think that you can actually own an animal. Now, you might be asking, what do you mean you can't own an animal? I've got little Fluffy, and I go to the vet, and the vet says, are you the owner of Fluffy? And I say, yes, I am. So I have to own the animal, right? No. No, you can be the caretaker of an animal, and there are some people that might say, well, caretaker and owner, that's a distinction without a difference. But I disagree. I believe that using the term caretaker implies some sense of responsibility, whereas an owner of something can destroy the thing. So I could, in theory, and I'm not going to do this because then I would need to spend money to buy a new one, but I could, throw my laptop across the room and, just break it into shards to where it's not usable. Because, the laptop is an inanimate thing. I can do with it what I want, as long as I'm not, infringing on somebody else. So, I couldn't take this next door and hit my neighbor in the head with the laptop because, well, that would be violating my neighbor's rights. But, the laptop itself does not have rights, and then that comes into the question of well, at what point does artificial intelligence or computers, when do they gain rights? And well, luckily we're not there, so we don't have to worry about when does artificial intelligence wind up getting rights. But the point is that you can do what you want with property. You can destroy property if you want. Animals, I don't believe, can be property, meaning that you can't just decide to, abuse and destroy Fluffy. Now, then that gets into the question of eating animals, and I know I've talked about that previously. I do think that, if you are claiming to be the caretaker, or some people would claim to be the owner of an animal, but I'll just use the term caretaker. If you are, the caretaker of an animal, and you want the animal to be your pet, then as soon as you claim that animal as, you're responsible for, you're the caretaker of, you have named the animal, you are feeding the animal, at that point, you, I believe, are responsible and liable for any medical expenses. Now, if you are raising an animal for food, and that gets into, a little trickier of a situation, because then there's the question of how do you determine which animals can be food? And I say if you want to cook it and eat it, it can be food. Now, I realize that there are certain things that are frowned upon in the United States that other cultures might not think twice about eating. There are things in other cultures that they will frown upon you eating, but in the United States is perfectly acceptable. The animal that comes to the front of my mind for the former would be dogs and cats, that in some Southeast Asian countries, from what I understand, are eaten on a fairly regular basis. The latter, a good example would be cows, where in India, especially among the Hindu population, cows are considered sacred. You do not eat cows in Hindu areas of India, but yet cows are considered, just a regular thing to be consumed in the United States. So, again, that whole question of, how do you determine what you eat? And the way I look at things is if you kill it, you should eat it. Now, I don't think there should necessarily be a law, and that gets into the next question. And this is something that, some people get really weird and particular on using the word should. And does the word should mean shall? Does that mean that, there should be a consequence? If you don't do X, then there's a consequence of Y or Z or whatever. Fill in the blank. I use X and Y because those are the ones that are most often used in like algebra and other, higher maths to where it's solve for X. And I never have understood, and yes, I know I'm derailing here, but I never have understood why people get confused with some of the algebra and geometry stuff to where they're like, I don't understand because there's letters with my numbers. And so when you were in first grade and kindergarten, they used shapes. That they would say 2 plus triangle equals 5. What goes in the triangle? Just replace triangle or the blank space with X, and then all of a sudden it's called algebra. 2 plus X equals 5, solve for X. Should not be any more confusing than 2 plus blank space equals 5. What goes in the blank space? But I realize I'm in the minority on that, where I don't get confused by math. There's more from the Ask Me Anything when we come back here on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio.
Cell 411 is a free app for Android and iOS that replaces government-controlled 911. Cell 411 allows you to preset a group of friends or private organizations to show up in any emergency. Cell 411 is a nightmare for the state because it proves their so-called services aren't needed. Cell 411 has had thousands of installs, and of course it's covered by the BIPCOT no government license. Cell 411 because your friends won't shoot you when you're in trouble. Without the government, who would build the emergency services? You and Cell 411. Get it today at getcell411.com. That's getcell411.com.
When you hear the word lobbyist, you probably think about greedy corporations, but not all lobbyists are the same. Some are fighting for the freedoms you hold dear. Liberty Lobby LLC is doing just that in New Hampshire, working hard to represent you, not some special interest group. You can help by going to libertylobby.info, where your contribution will give us the tools we need to ensure that your voice is heard. Visit libertylobby.info today to find out more.
You're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio with Darryl W. Perry.
Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com. I am your host, Darryl W. Perry, the Liberty Penguin, the Wombat, the uncut cocaine of libertarianism. And it's Friday, which means it's the day that I answer your questions, and I have a good many of them, and I'm glad I do. The next question, and this is a three-parter, and I love these multi-part questions because then it sort of allows me to sort of ramble and go off on more tangents than if it's just a one-parter. And I have to say that open-ended questions are also much better than yes/no questions. Just a little side note there. And again, if you have any, you can send those to me at ama@fppradio.com. So send an email, ama@fppradio.com. Question: repeal or amend? How many laws do we really need? What would they be and why? Well, the first part, repeal or amend, I would have to say which section of the myriad of statutes. Most of them could probably, just repeal and they would be fine. Other ones, maybe amend a word here or there. But again, I would need to know exactly which statute and regulation you're asking about before I could tell you. How many laws do we really need? This is where things get tricky, right? And it's not necessarily how many laws do we need, but how many interpretations of the single law do we need? Do we need to try to, write down and regulate every little minutia of the one law that I think should exist? You heard me right. The one law that should exist. That law, and that's kind of answering the third part second, right? Where the third part of the question is, what would they be? That being the laws that do exist, where questioner is, how many do we need? I think we need one. What would it be? It would be, quite simply, the non-aggression principle, which is the basis for human interaction. There are some people that say that it's the end-all, be-all of human interaction, and you can be a complete a-hole to one another as long as you're abiding by the non-aggression principle, or what some people call the NAP, then you're okay, and nobody should say anything about it. But I think that it's the basis for human behavior, and then you get into the minutia of what actually can be construed to be aggression. So the non-aggression principle, basically, and there are many interpretations of how this can be written, but basically it boils down to everyone has the same rights as everyone else and can do as they please with their body and their property, as long as they do not cause unjust harm to another person or the property of another person. There are some people that will say justly acquired property, and I'm fine with that. And there are other people that there's one iteration of the non-aggression principle that says it shall be lawful for anyone to do as they please, blah, blah, blah. But again, we're just, sort of splitting hairs over the actual way to say it. But that should be the law that exists. And that covers, the non-aggression principle covers theft. Don't steal from other people, because then you are causing unjust harm to another person or their property. Don't assault people, because then you're causing unjust harm to another person or their property. Don't vandalize other people's stuff. Don't murder anybody, because murder definitely violates the equal rights and equal liberty of another person by, shortening their life, which, harms another person. And those are the spots where people can basically agree about what the non-aggression principle actually is, right? So people generally agree that theft violates the non-aggression principle. Now, there's minutia about whether or not the property being taken was justly acquired, and then there's various interpretations on how much force and what kind of force can be used to retrieve stolen property. And I disagree that it is moral and ethical to wind up killing someone who steals a paperclip from you. I disagree that murder is the appropriate response, or attempted murder is the appropriate response if someone trespasses onto your flower bed. So let's just give an example here to where somebody's walking down the sidewalk, and let's just say that there's a puddle of water in the sidewalk. And that happens where I live, to where, we get a lot of snow. Sidewalks aren't completely flat all the time. Snow starts to melt, puddle of water. So somebody's walking down the sidewalk, puddle of water, big ice pile on the left side between them and the road, and there's your flower bed on the right side of the sidewalk. And, well, instead of stepping in this, 4 inches of water, step in your flower bed. The appropriate response is not to kill the person that stepped on your flower bed, even though technically they trespassed on your property. And so this comes down, again, into the weird sort of interpretation area of the non-aggression principle and how should one respond to acts of aggression. But, again, the question was, how many laws should there be? What should they be? And, again, the answer is there should be the one law, the non-aggression principle. But then how do you wind up interpreting all of that? And I don't think that you should try to write down into some form of, like a book of statutes every little circumstance that could come up, because then you wind up micromanaging human existence and trying to centrally plan a free society. And I don't think that you can do that. You cannot rightly centrally plan liberty, because central planning is antithetical to human freedom. Stay tuned. There's more here on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com. Are you tired of governments murdering people around the world? Stop using their money. There is an alternative. Bitcoin is a stateless, free market, non-political currency. Bitcoin cannot be inflated or controlled by any government. By using their money, you are helping the state. Stop doing it. You have an incredible alternative available now. Learn it, use it, spread it. Get started with Bitcoin at weusecoins.com. That's weusecoins.com. Born into a devastating world and raised among the crowd, the Cloudwalker assumes a new identity and begins the unrelenting quest for truth. In this epic journey, he discovers dark secrets about aspects of his previous life that he once trusted. Through the Journal of the Cloudwalker, he shares both the traumatic hardships and the eternal beauties of his experiences. Fueled in the beginning by his unsettling thoughts and emotions, he learns how to find peace with everything he has woken up to. Dear Society by the Cloudwalker is available from Amazon.com and all major bookstores.
You're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com.
Hey, welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com. I am your host, Darryl W. Perry, the Liberty Penguin, the Wombat, the uncut cocaine of libertarianism. We'll get back into the questions here in just a second, but first I want to make sure that I tell you about Roberts & Roberts Brokerage. Since 1977, Roberts & Roberts Brokerage has been a trusted source for buying and selling precious metals like gold and silver. They take Bitcoin for precious metal purchases, and they're actually Bitcoin preferred. What do I mean by that? Well, they've removed the minimum purchase amount for all orders paid in the digital currency. So call Roberts & Roberts Brokerage today for knowledgeable advice on buying and selling precious metals and a forward-thinking approach to new technologies. 800-874-9760. That's 800-874-9760. Or visit them online at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. Back into the questions. And this is one that I may have hinted, hey, somebody please ask me this question, and you know what? Somebody did. Somebody asked me the question that I asked for a reminder on Monday. Is a Snuggie an article of clothing? And you know how I said that open-ended questions are better than yes-no questions? Well, this, very briefly, one-word answer, no. Now, how do we know this, and why do we know this? Are questions that were not asked, but they're questions that I will answer because that's what I do. I take simple questions and then I make them complex, and then I give you information that you probably did not know that you needed to know. The article from Heat Street, dated February 17th, so last Friday. Believe it or not, it took a U.S. court to determine whether a Snuggie counts as a blanket or an article of clothing. Why does a court care? The simple answer, and this is really the underlying answer to a lot of the things that courts wind up deciding, and it's also the underlying reason that a lot of free markets, some people refer to them as black markets, I prefer to think of them as freed markets. It's the reason they exist. It's the reason that, Brandy exists. Not Brandy as in a girl named Brandy, but Brandy, the alcohol. The reason it exists. Taxes. That's right. Taxation. That form of theft that is legal when governments do it is the reason that a court had to determine whether or not a Snuggie, also called the WTF blanket, and if you've not seen that video on YouTube, absolutely hilarious. You should pull it up, but be warned that the language might not be appropriate for certain situations. But it's the reason that a court had to determine that, yes, a Snuggie is a blanket. Taxation. Blankets, you see, face an import duty of just 8.5%, compared to the much higher rate of 14.9% for clothing. That adds up, especially considering that All-Star Marketing Group sold more than 30 million Snuggies in the first 5 years. You heard that right. 30 million WTF blankets, also called Snuggies, sold in the first 5 years, meaning that All-Star Marketing Group, just from the sale of Snuggie, earned an amount of money matching the GDP of Samoa. As this delightful U.S. Court of International Trade ruling notes, quote, the key inquiry is whether the addition of sleeves transforms what may have been a blanket into something that is not a blanket. The federal government wanted to classify Snuggies as an article of clothing because of the aforementioned sleeves. And I'll post the 32-page ruling. Yes, you heard that right. A 32-page ruling from the U.S. Court of International Trade. I'll post that link in the show notes. You can read it at your leisure if you so choose. And it's a lot more interesting than you might realize. The article from Heat Street continues. The federal government, again, wanted to classify Snuggies as clothing, categorizing them alongside swimsuits and leotards. In support of this classification, the U.S. Department of Justice posited that Snuggies look like a clerical or ecclesiastical garment and vestment, or perhaps professional or scholastic gowns or robes. Yes, you heard that right. A blanket with sleeves was classified by the Department of Justice as looking similar to clerical or ecclesiastical garments or vestments, or professional or scholastic gowns or robes. So could you imagine someone on their graduation day from college walking across the stage being handed their master's degree or their bachelor's of science, their BS, wearing a Snuggie? I don't think you would take them seriously. If you went to church on Sunday and the preacher was standing behind the pulpit wearing a Snuggie, would you listen to anything he said? I don't think you would. But the court did agree with All-Star Marketing Group, which agreed in part, or rather which argued in part, that because the Snuggie lacks any rear closure, it is not an article of clothing that is ordinarily worn. All-Star did concede that some people have worn Snuggies during pub crawls, but the ruling and the case came down to the very sleeves that the DOJ said made the Snuggie a garment. I'll tell you all about that in the closing moments here of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio.
It is the year 91,001 BCE. Witness humanity's origins in Hyperchronius, a classic role-playing game for Windows PCs with a story like no other game before. A liberty-oriented experience that is not to be missed. Go to zog.ninja to get your copy of Hyperchronius today. Use the code FPP to get $1 off. Hyperchronius, zog.ninja, code FPP.
You can support FPP Radio by joining the Fans program. Fans are friends, allies, and numerary supporters. Fans help FPP afford to produce more original content. You can join the Fans program for as little as $3 per month through Patreon and get perks like ad-free versions of FPP Radio News and Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. To learn more or to join the Fans program, visit fans.fppradio.com. That's FANS.fppradio.com.
Hi, I'm Nick Hazelton from the Anarcho-Yakutalism podcast, and you're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio.
Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. Sleeves. It's all about the sleeves. What am I talking about being all about the sleeves? That would be whether or not the Snuggie is an article of clothing or whether the Snuggie is a blanket. Now, I already told you that the Snuggie is a blanket. But let's delve into this ruling just a little bit. Footnote 7 is particularly interesting, where they refer to the sleeves as tubes that are merely sleeve-like, according to All-Star Marketing Group, or as the defendant, that being the U.S. federal government, classified them as just sleeves. So are the tubes of cloth sleeve-like, or are they sleeves? The parties agreed that the tubes attached to the polyester fleece rectangles may be categorized as sleeves. And then All-Star Marketing Group says that because they comply with the voluntary blanket flammability standards, then it should be just considered a blanket. And specifically about the tubes, they say 2 holes are cut and tubes of the same polyester fleece are sewn into the holes. The plaintiffs include the following measurements of the sleeve-like things. The ruling itself states the following: the sleeves support rather than detract from the Snuggie's primary design and use as a blanket, because they ostensibly enable the Snuggie to remain in place and keep the user warm while allowing the user to engage in certain activities requiring use of their hands, the court said, concluding that the Snuggie's essential characteristic was to keep sedentary people warm. And then going down to the final paragraph, they say the undisputed facts show that the Snuggie preserves the essential characteristics of a blanket. The sleeves, again, support rather than detract. The court thus concludes that the Snuggie is correctly classified as a blanket. For the foregoing reasons, the court holds that the subject import is properly classified under tariff number, and then they give the number. But this, again, it's just absolutely fascinating that it wound up going to a court to decide whether the Snuggie was a blanket or an article of clothing. And you may recall I previously talked about a court case where a court had to decide whether a burrito was a sandwich. And you only know that because of the Ask Me Anything, where every Friday I answer your questions. Send those over, ama@fppradio.com.
The podcasts of FPP Radio are licensed under Copy Heart. We believe that copying is a form of flattery and do not abide by the copyright laws. Those laws serve to restrict the flow of ideas which no one can really own. Copying is an act of love. love is not subject to law. If you enjoy the show, consider joining the Fans program and get perks like ad-free versions of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio and FPP Radio News, and also get a copy of the monthly newspaper FPP News. To learn more or to join the Fans program, visit fans.fppradio.com.